Fishing the DMV has big plans for the future, but to get there, I need your help. Our first Patreon goal is 100 Patreon subscribers for $6 a month, which is less than a pack of Cincos or a jackhammer chatterbait. For more information on our Patreon, please go check it out in the episode description down below. Thank you so much. You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your host, Thomas Ahrens. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked up, I don't know what will.
Alrighty, guys, here we are from Monday Night Live. How's everybody doing tonight? Let me know how the audio sounds in the chat. This is the big giveaway Chick-fil-A show. We're going to be giving away Chick-fil-A and Jake's Bait and Tackle to all the people listening that comment down below. I'll pick a question, you get a card. That's how this whole thing works. We have gone 6 whole months without missing a Monday, and this has been an absolutely incredible journey. And this is the first, I guess, head of state, so to speak, that we've had on a live stream. I think I'm going to do one with Odenkirk next year is kind of my hope. Big shout out to Odenkirk. We had such a great conversation. I decided to break it up into 2 parts because there's 2 distinct things we were talking about. It was the invasive species issue with the Alabama bass, and then we talked about the work that he's done at Lake Anna and Occoquan Reservoir. And so we split that up. Today, it was the Alabama bass talk that dropped. Tomorrow is going to be the talk about Lake Anna and Occoquan Reservoir. And then if you guys missed this live stream, it will be re-uploaded as a podcast and as a YouTube video on Wednesday morning. So that kind of keeps track with everything. But without a moment ado, the guest I have is to talk about the situation on the Chesapeake Bay. We had David Sikorski on, I think it was last year, and we did like a 6-hour podcast. We're going to keep this one a little bit tighter than that, but we're going to talk about what the hell is going on with the stripers. So without any ado, here he is. Sir, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. It's great to be back. And yes, my wife would be very pleased if we kept this one under 6 hours.
Yeah. So will mine. So, I mean, let's pretend no one heard that other podcast episode. Guys, I'll link it in the episode description after the live stream. Kind of give people your background and just the build up to what we're about to talk about.
Sure. So I'm just somebody that likes to fish a lot, and fast forward over life, and I've landed in a position where I work in fisheries. I represent recreational anglers. My current job is the executive director of Coastal Conservation Association, Maryland. That's one of the state chapters of CCA, or Coastal Conservation Association. We're a nationwide nonprofit, first started in the late 70s in the Houston, Texas area. Shout out to a amazing video called Redfish Redemption that was just done in Texas. It really tells the story of CCA's founding down there, which was 14 individuals got together and said, you know what, our fisheries are not being managed properly. Recreational anglers don't have a voice, and that means the resource itself does not have a voice. And it was all around red drum and shallow water gill nets. And so that was really what got CCA going in the Texas Gulf Coast back in the late 70s. And fast forward through the years, various people, small groups, just like those 14 original folks, have created state chapters in various states like Maryland. So in Maryland in 1995, a group of people got together and said, you know what, we want this group here. We like their track record. We like the work they've done to represent the resource, represent recreational angling. So we're going to form a chapter. And the good part about CCA is we're part of a nationwide network with a lot of history and success, and just the brain trust of folks that are representing recreational angling throughout the coastal states. We have chapters from Maryland down to Florida, around the Horn, all the way through the Gulf Coast, all the way to Texas. Every single state has representation from here to there. And then also the full West Coast. And then we have an inland chapter in Nashville, Tennessee. And, we're focused on initially advocating for the resource, but also just making sure that people are educated and can get involved in resource management or be informed as participants in a recreational fishery, so they can understand their impact on the resource and how it's managed. And then more recently in CCA's history, we really dug in and done a lot of habitat work. So we know that you can't just advocate and argue over rules and regulations all day long. We roll our sleeves up and we build artificial reefs. We do it through a school system. We probably talked about that last time at length. But ultimately, we travel around and work with future generations to try and light that spark so they're interested in fishing. They care about the Chesapeake Bay, regardless of whether they fish from it. They're probably going to eat something that comes from it at some point in their life. And living in the watershed, we find it really important that we start young with getting kids involved to show their passion for the bay, no matter which way they're going to utilize it, whether it be, in our freshwater tributaries or out there on the main bay in the big water. There's so much to be enjoyed by our resources in this region. And with me growing up as a native Marylander, I love to hunt and fish both, and just love that time I can be out there. And frankly, the privilege that I can go out and take a natural resource that belongs to all of us, bring it home, maybe let it go, but utilize it for my own personal benefit. And I think with that comes a bit of a weight on our shoulders, for all of us as individuals. We have to be stewards of the resource. And I've got involved with CCA as a volunteer, and I volunteered for more than a decade. And for some reason, the fisheries management stuff and the policy work, as we call it making sausage, because it's a mix of all these kinds of things coming together, and you don't really want to see it happen. But in the end, you want the result to be palatable. So it's not easy, but for some reason, I've gravitated towards the policy work for many years now, and I've been involved in this work for about 18 years. Is about the right clock right now.
I think that's also something that's very, really important to mention. And then, guys, again, please like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out in the algorithm. Best comments are going to win a Chick-fil-A gift card and also possibly a gift card to Jake's Bait and Tackle. Getting involved in your local, whatever advisory board it is, whatever local community, it's so important. And then for new members that don't know, I was nominated or allowed to sneak into the Black Bass Advisory Board for Maryland. And I was the youngest there by a lot. And that really jarred me that what is going on there? Is it that we don't have a lot of young anglers, or we don't have a lot of young anglers that want to actually get involved? I think it's one of the two. And I would encourage, if you're listening to this, try to get involved in something, and don't just be a social media warrior and just type in like there were some issues, blah, blah, blah. Get involved in your community, please.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of how I got involved as well. I mean, first volunteering, and while I was a volunteer, before I started working for CCA, which I started in 2017 full time. So I actually got talked to my predecessor called one day and said, "Hey, there's this thing called the Sport Fisheries Advisory Commission, and we've been talking with DNR. We think you'd be good at that. Is it something you might be interested in? If it is, why don't you go ahead and fill out this form and submit it to DNR?" So I did that, and that was in 2009. So I was 27 years old, far and away one of the youngest, and had a lot to learn, but also had a lot of the old guard to learn from as well. And so that's important. I think the focus of the Sport Fish Advisory Commission is to provide advice to DNR, specifically to the fisheries director, but ultimately to the secretary. The secretary is, of course, a member of the governor's cabinet. And so it's an important seat at the table. In like I said, in the case of the Sport Fish Advisory Commission, it's governor appointed. There's 15 positions. Well, the Black Bass Advisory Committee that you're now on, that's an important way that the Sport Fish Commission could grow its ranks and bring in more people that are informed, that participate in our fisheries. In your case, that participate in the black bass or largemouth bass fisheries. And it's more than just black bass. It's all of our areas that you'll find black bass that we're looking for folks to advise. And so that was the first committee to be created under the Sport Fish Commission. And then the second committee to be created was a cold water fisheries committee. And the prior chair of the Sport Fish Commission, a gentleman named John Neely, was a diehard fly angler and conservation-minded angler. And he said, we need to do this elsewhere too. At the time, I was vice chair of Sportfish, or SFAC. And I said, John, let's work together with the department, with the hardworking folks at Maryland DNR, and let's make sure we actually expand this all the way into tidal waters and coastal waters. So now we've done that, and there's 3 standing committees. So there's black bass, there's cold water, and then there's tidal and coastal. And so those committees all meet at least quarterly. They all have staff leads at Maryland DNR that facilitate the conversation. You guys have got a great one in black bass with Dr. Joe Love. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better facilitator and just fishery manager, and all around individual. He's a great person. And then ultimately, so we have that broad swath, let's say, to bring information to the department, and then also have the department disseminate information to all of us. And we're meant to be ambassadors, and you have to wear all the hats. You bring your personal perspective. That's important. but also recognize that these fisheries are participated in by the general public. They belong to the general public. And I've learned over the years, especially watching some of the older guard and the leaders that I follow, there's ways to do it right, and there's ways to maybe do it wrong. And it's for each of us to try and figure that out. That's this public process that, believe it or not, as a government across this country, in theory, we have a voice, and we need to, use it. So it's tough. It's important.
It really is, and then that's a good segue to kind of the big talk that we're gonna do. If you want, I can start sharing the slides now. Is there any kind of intro really into this at all, or?
No, visual aids are great. I'm going to be talking about, I think, like I did in the last one, a bit about the status of the fishery, some of the tools we use to manage the fishery, and so I think the pictures will help. We'll kick it off with a few things about CCA, because I think it's important to see it in writing, what we're all about. As an advocacy organization, we often people often tell us what we think, what we believe, what we're up to. Representing recreational anglers, people always say, "Oh, you're anti-commercial," and no, we just want a balanced resource to be managed properly. It's kind of up to the agencies to do that, because they're the ones with the authority. So.
And then again, guys, with all that said, basically, as the title suggests, there's been some data coming out on the striped bass population that is not looking great. This was hinted at to me back in June, but while he was still here, Potomac River Fishery Commission, Martin Gary, when he was here, we talked about that off camera, and it's kind of, I have some thoughts. I want to get your opinion on them. If you guys have a question, put it in the comment section down below. At the end, we'll go through all the questions. Best questions are going to win a prize. So here we go.
I talked about this one a little bit, but ultimately CCA is made up. We're a membership organization, so by our membership, we do fundraising. We've actually got an Annapolis chapter banquet fundraiser this Thursday. So we have local chapters throughout the region. We have them in Maryland and Virginia, and ultimately folks come together and say, "Hey, we want to help fundraise," and with those funds, we advocate and we build habitat. Slide 2 speaks to what we do. What is our purpose? Our purpose is to advise and educate the public on the conservation of marine resources. I mentioned that. You don't have to agree with everything that we as an organization put out. We try and put out the facts, and so you can be educated. Try to lead a horse to water on at least the ultimate outcomes we seek, because our objective is to conserve, promote, and enhance the present and future availability of these resources for the benefit and the enjoyment of the general public. And you'll notice the theme, the public. And it doesn't say public in the third one, but ensuring the health and conservation of our coastal resources and anglers' access to them means that we're managing in a way that the public can access the resource. And that's quite often lost. And it's very difficult to kind of keep that global mind of the public in general, and make sure that we're regulating in a way that is fair and equitable for all users, which is not easy. And so ultimately, we may have talked about this last time, actually, because if you go to the next slide, that's kind of the news right now. 2 weeks ago, we did hear that Maryland released what's commonly called their Young of Year survey results. And so what this bar chart shows you, or bar graph shows you, is over time observations by field biologists of Maryland DNR. And they do the same thing in a couple of different tributaries, but it's the Chesapeake as a whole, Maryland and Virginia. And then the Hudson is the second biggest producer area for juvenile striped bass. There is production in the Delaware Bay as well. And there's some up in Maine that is also reviewed by fisheries managers. And so what this information is based on folks going out into the water with a seine net. That's a net that the fish can't swim through. It's got really small holes. There's a lead line on the bottom. There's a corks along the top. I think it's a 6-foot net. It may be 4 feet, but it's relatively short. And it's a beach seine. And so the biologists actually, there's a pole on one end that one person will spike into the ground and hold on the shore. And then they'll walk the net out and then do a swept area survey. So they'll actually sweep the net back around to the shoreline as the net stays stretched. And then all the fish that were in that swept area are going to be corralled and counted. And you're going to find a lot of different species. You're going to find, especially some of the migratory bait species like the shad. You'll find bay anchovies. You may find, lots of young of year of these different animals that are born in the estuary. And ultimately, this shows the results of how many young of year striped bass. age 0, ones that were born in the late spring, early summer, and are out there in our waterway. And so what this shows is a year-to-year comparison. It's considered an index, and then the black line is the long-term average. And so in management, there's all sorts of different rules related to this, but one of them is if multiple year classes in a row or fall below average, then it triggers coastwide management action at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And actually, that's the next slide. But if you look, before we move on, you see those last 5 years. Those last 5 years are the last 5 years of very below average recruitment or young of year surviving in the Chesapeake. And so that's ultimately what those biologists have observed as they sweep that net, and they do it throughout the state. I think there's 40 different stations in the tributaries in Maryland's portion of the bay. And there's a couple that they reserve to use different years, depending on weather conditions. But the big bars are what we want. You look back in the 80s. I was born in 1982. Actually, looks like it wasn't a terrible year class, relatively speaking, that year. But you can see that period in the mid 80s of just really poor recruitment. Unfortunately, not too different than what we have right now. And Maryland closed the fishery from 1985 to 1990 in response because of that and other things.
If I may,
Hmm?
if by looking at this chart here, I see a pattern that you can see that there was a dip in 1981, another peak in really the early 2000s, like late 90s, and then it's going back down again. What specifically about this downturn makes you guys a little bit more wary compared to when you look at the downturn that happened in 1981?
Yeah. So ultimately, you see the cycle. You see prior to the 80s, a little bit, decent year classes, like you said, that dip and then that increase, and then coming back down. What's different today, there's two things. Well, many things. So first, natural cycles are common. And there's many folks out there that would say nature's going to go up and down. Things are going to go up and down, especially in fisheries. And they definitely see them, 20 plus 30-year cycles. And I think this reflects something somewhat similar. It's something called multi-decadal oscillation of the ocean currents. And it's actually been described by looking at data and various scientific studies. Of course, we have global climate change. We have regional climate change. I know for a fact that in the mid-Atlantic, water temperatures have been increasing more rapidly than most places on Earth. And then in other parts of the globe, you'll see them decreasing. And so it's not just this simple warming trend necessarily, but there's changes in the climate. And so regardless of going into that whole topic, the reality is we have different weather patterns. We have different prevailing climatic patterns, and they could be based on ocean currents. They could be precipitation based. There's lots of things going on out there in the greater environment. But with striped bass, we know that when you have warmer winters with less snowpack, less precipitation, you're going to have poor spawning results. And so we want gradual, slow warming winter, or a cold winter that warms up nice and gradually. We want plenty of water flow, but you want consistency. And so a nice uptick in temperature, because striped bass will ultimately, they'll get on the spawning grounds or at least be staging as early as February. And some folks are even saying that they're showing up earlier than ever before. And so whatever's triggering that decision point by the big mature females, and then of course the males that have to be there too, something's happening. I don't know that there's a lot of science or studies looking into that necessarily. We're kind of looking at what we have to observe what's out there, and then we guess what might happen moving forward so that we can control the harvest of the fish or the various removals of the fishery. But the take-home message here is that this is an environmental thing. You can have varying sizes of striped bass population produce variable year classes. You see, obviously, there was really late 70s, early 80s. The population wasn't nearly as high as it was at the peak, but it produced some good year classes, and we can assume that we had some good weather patterns during that period. And of course, the 90s into the 2000s, we had good weather patterns as well. Believe it or not, CCA, we started advocating in about 2013 or so, 2014, to actually kind of signal the alarm. and say we think abundance is dwindling in the Chesapeake, and that we should control fishing mortality incrementally starting way back then. And I've got a slide a little bit later on that can kind of speak to the management changes over time.
When you're ready, I can go to the next slide.
Well, yeah, so the next slide will be an introduction to Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. That's what ASMFC stands for. And so where I said earlier, I work for CCA. That is my full-time job. We would be involved in the ASMFC process regardless of my involvement. It's something that CCA gets involved in there to advocate for fisheries that are important to recreational anglers. And so I actually was first introduced to the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission just showing up at a meeting. We're fortunate that if you're in the DMV area, you can go to these meetings. All but one meeting a year are in Crystal City, and then one meeting they travel. And so the annual meeting was last week, and that was in Beaufort, North Carolina. So it goes to a different member state each year. Next year, Annapolis, Maryland is hosting in Annapolis. But ultimately, there's great access is the take-home message. And what these arrows are pointing out on the screen is Management 101 is a great tab and a great place for people to start if you're interested in this stuff, to understand some of the jargon, and then you can read on through the commission website, because ultimately what the commission is it's an organization of member states from Maine to Florida. It also includes the District of Columbia and the Potomac River Fisheries Commission. And there's also a Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries representation on the various management boards. So for Atlantic striped bass, they exist from North Carolina through Maine and even up into Canada. But there is no Canadian representation on this board. It's just Maine through North Carolina and then the other jurisdictions I mentioned. And so I actually sit on the striped bass board, as well as every other board except for river herring and shad and menhaden. Allison Colden, who is the executive director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, she serves on those boards, but I serve on the others. And I actually hold the seat of a legislator. So the way that the commission works is there's 3 seats from each jurisdiction, except for the feds. And ultimately, and I think DC only has 1 seat, as well as the Potomac. But ultimately, the states have 3 seats. 2 are executive branch and 1 is legislative branch. And so the legislator that holds the seat now is Delegate Dana Stein. He's in the Baltimore County area, and he chose me as his ongoing proxy. So that means I sit in the seat, I attend the meetings, I speak into the microphone, and I go through all the different efforts of working at the commission as a volunteer on his behalf. And then, like I mentioned, Dr. Colden has 2 of the species boards that she covers. So the other representation is executive branch. 1 person is selected by the governor. The governor appoints somebody as their appointee. And in this case, in our current case, it is a commercial fishing stakeholder, a gentleman named Russell Dyes, and also Robert T. Brown from the Maryland Watermen's Association actually share the seat, which is the governor's appointee. And that is a carryover from previous governors. And then ultimately, the administrative seat is somebody that works at DNR, which is still the executive branch. So when it comes down to it, there's 3 of us sitting at the table, and it's a 2 to 1 vote, essentially. And you coordinate how the state votes, because the state votes once. The whole thing is managed by what's called Robert's Rules of Order. So you've got a chair, you have everybody sitting around the table, lots of stuff. If you've never attended one of these, you'll be thinking, there's motions, there's lots of other things happening. But ultimately, I wanted to highlight this because this has a ton of information. You can actually go back through old meeting materials. You can read the words that came out of my mouth at various meetings and see what folks had to say. And it's an important thing. Ultimately, the ASMFC is really an experiment in states' rights. The idea being that the states collectively agreed to enter into a compact, an agreement that says, you know what, we share this resource. These fish swim up and down this coast, and we need to figure out who gets to take what when. And we're a lot better off if we put together our science power, we work together, and we try and make sure we make coast-wide type decisions and not just decisions that may just work well for Marylanders, for example. So it truly is making sausage on every level. It's very complicated. We are advised by technical committees, which are the science experts from either state offices like Maryland DNR, for example. The commission also has some scientific staff, and we also the commission partners with federal scientists as well to do what's called stock assessments, and that's actually what that second arrow is pointing to. A stock assessment is exactly that. It's an assessment of the stock of fish or the population of fish, and each species is done a little bit differently. But they've always said that striped bass is the most data-rich species we have. And up until recent history, it's kind of been the poster child for the success of the Atlantic States Commission. And with the rebound post-moratorium and that big increase in population that we've seen, that's unfortunately now turned in the wrong direction.
Guys, I'll try to link. I will on the re-upload. I'm going to link in the episode description everything that we talked about here, websites and everything, so everyone can go find this. Did you want me to go to the next slide?
Yeah, sure.
5 or straight down? Okay.
Yeah. So these are the very basics of stock assessment. And in a different time, I actually was really fortunate to work as a facilitator for a program called the Marine Resource Education Program. That's a program largely funded by NOAA and coordinated out of a group called the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And it's doing amazing work around our country and our territories where there is federal management of fisheries. So our Pacific Islands, Puerto Rico, there's places that the United States is involved in fisheries management outside of just the lower 48. And so ultimately, MREP, the Marine Resources Education Program, is a place that anybody can sign up to participate in. There's ongoing classes. Folks that are directly impacted by management or directly involved are encouraged to take these. So I took them way back when, and then ultimately was asked to become a facilitator. So I took this information because I think it's very important for anglers to understand the realities of population assessment. So all this slide shows is it's very simple. How many fish are born? How many fish die? How many come into an area? And how many leave? And it'd be one thing if we were managing a closed system like a reservoir. You could probably nail down these numbers pretty darn easy. But when you're talking coastwide migration, including the Atlantic Ocean, there's a lot of places these fish can be and can go, and it's very difficult to assess their population. So we talked about young of year. That's the birth. We checked that box. And now we'll talk about the next one.
And then I also have to add, because I thought this was cool as shit when you told on the last podcast episode that you used to chase tuna around the Atlantic Ocean. So when he says it's a pain in the ass, like, yeah, you're talking from experience.
Yeah. In my 20s, I spent a lot of time fishing out of Ocean City, Maryland, and all over the place. So I've been very fortunate to do a lot of fishing. There's a lot of stuff on the walls behind me. It reminds me of those times before kids and before working in this space. But ultimately, yeah, we have birth, we have age, right? Because as long as you're still alive, you have an age, and you're going to grow during a certain period. And so, how do scientists know this stuff? And it's experience. Nothing's changing very rapidly in fish growth and those types of things. Like a species is what it is, and in our time on Earth, they don't evolve quick enough, I think, for these things to change too much. But it's important to understand population dynamics. And so, the two images on the right are something called an otolith. An otolith is a bone inside of a fish's brain or in the brain cavity. Every bony fish has them. So the cartilaginous stuff like sharks do not, but every bony fish has otoliths. So next time you harvest a fish, you can cut through the skull, get to where the brain is. And on the bottom side, they'll actually kind of sit in a fluid sac, and they're a little bit curved. And as you can see, they're kind of a funny shape. But what they do is they lay down rings just like a tree. And so in the cold weather periods, you'll get a more dense growth pattern because it's growing slowly. In the warm weather periods, you're getting a wider, thinner kind of growth pattern. And so it's hard to see on this, but if you zoomed in, you'd be able to see lines just like a tree. Well, one per year, you kill the fish and you take an otolith out, you can pretty much guarantee the size. There you go. Yeah, so all these little marks on the left there are just showing years. And it looks just like a cross section of a tree. And so age and growth labs exist around the country to age otoliths. There's one up in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, where mostly a team of women actually analyzes these. I know it's been found that the women tend to do better and be more accurate, probably better attention to detail. But ultimately, it tells you how old the fish is. Scales are the other factor. Scales also lay down a line, just like the otolith. But they, on a long-lived species like that striped bass I'm holding there, that's a big female. And on that long-lived fish, we know that the scales are less accurate once you get above about, I think it's about a dozen, 15 years old, the scales become less accurate. But believe it or not, during the young of year surveys, they will actually take a scale sample by pulling backwards on the scales with a little blade, pull the scales off, they slide them into an envelope. That envelope has information written on it, and then it goes back to an age and growth lab here in Maryland, so that they can analyze and make sure that those fish that they're counting are age 0 and aren't really, really small ones from the year before. But ultimately, I threw in the 2 pictures of the striped bass because in Maryland, we have this unique opportunity, really the whole Chesapeake, where we get the big ones coming in. That's a February morning. And the picture of me holding that fish there. And you've got the fish in the shallows, like that other little one. That's 6 feet of water down in Tangier Sound. That's a young fish. That's probably a 18-incher.
Wow.
So we have them when they're big. They're going to come in for a time, lay their eggs, turn around and leave. The males are going to be a little more, they're going to hang out a little bit longer in their life cycle. But the female fish, after being born, we know from observation, are leaving the Chesapeake as early as age 4 and are more prevalent to be out in the ocean once they reach age 7 or 8, which is their sexual maturity. So you have to understand these things, in order to properly manage the fish is the bottom line.
And I think the biggest thing to highlight is something you said a little bit earlier when it comes down to if you're an enclosed reservoir, the ability to make big changes and to really get your data down is so much easier than when you are dealing with a bay of an ocean. And what the work you guys are doing, it is an uphill struggle just to begin with what you're dealing with.
Yeah. And especially if you consider like the Chesapeake as a whole, we always think of the bay, or you think of the river that you may care about, but it goes up to New York. It's out to West Virginia. It's Virginia. It's all these different jurisdictions, Pennsylvania, that have an impact on the bay. And so over time, these striped bass, like the big difference from the 80s to now is the population of people that live in the Chesapeake and the amount of impervious surface, the amount of runoff, the amount of pollution, no matter what kind of pollution it might be. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the 2 that really drive and impact the health of the Chesapeake as far as water quality is concerned. And those are 2 we look at a lot. They're very important because it definitely relates to habitat that's suitable for striped bass or any other fish. And where I speak about the habitat work CCA does, we build artificial reef structures. We're trying to build that base of structure, but habitat's all the way through the water column. And you've got to have oxygen. You've got to have the right stuff for these fish to survive. So ultimately what we're looking at on the screen here is an unfortunate reality of all things that live. There is death. And so when you have an animal that only spawns once a year, you can make better assumptions about their rate of decay or the loss over time. And so this is just a generic exponential decay graph. And so as it says, instead of being positive like your interest rate in your checking account, it's negative. And so if 1,000 fish are born, eventually there's going to be 0 out of that cohort or out of that class of fish. And managers try and describe that exponential decay because in the end, all that we can control is fishing mortality or what we allow by regulation people to take. Nature has its own plans. And so the next one will show you a little more detail of what fishing mortality is, because that's the one we're looking at. Natural mortality is the other one. And so F is the acronym or the what's used for fishing mortality. M is used for fishing F is fishing mortality. M is natural mortality. Both are exponential decay. They're the exact same kind of curve. So the blue line here, F equals 0. This would be just a system where we're not allowing any kind of fishing. There's no fishing at all. So the fish that die are going to die from a natural curve. That's the blue line. Red is F of 0.2. 0.2 is roughly 20% of the population, but it's not that simple. It's a exponential decay, and so it's an instantaneous rate of decay. Technically, every little point of that curve has a different trajectory. It's steeper in the earlier section, and then it's flatter in the later section. So it's not consistent across that life cycle. Also, the older the fish get and the less there are, you actually apply less fishing mortality to those older classes because they're not available for anglers to catch. And there's a different way I'm going to show that. And one of the reasons I got so into this was I was fishing for striped bass a lot when I first got involved in the Sport Fish Advisory Commission, and I was paying attention to young of year. I was paying attention to the data, and then I was paying attention to what I was catching, and it was amazing to see that correlation. And you'd be able to see those year classes of fish, and you can definitely tell when they're missing. I know that's definitely something I've seen you talk about and heard folks talk about with the smallmouth bass situation. You know.
Yeah, and this is so fascinating to me. And then, guys, again, we are going to break from the timeline here because this is a damn good question Otis just asked. Otis, you just won a gift card to Chick-fil-A. Again, guys, best comment down below will be winning some gift cards tonight. How confident are you that the young of year sample size and collection technique is mapping onto the true bay-wide numbers? Easy to imagine them avoiding structureless shallows in some conditions.
Yep, great question, and one I hear all the time. And ultimately, young of year is what it is. It's not counting the population of fish bay-wide, so it's not extrapolated to say, okay, this is how many we believe there are necessarily. It's a much more complex model that takes in other things into account. There's also kind of a long-standing history which sets the overall understanding about biomass. Biomass, of course, is a weight, but abundance would be another way of describing a population, how many individual animals. And so I'm pretty confident that I'm very confident in the team at Maryland DNR is going out there and doing the same thing as close as they can to the same thing in the same places, which is important for the way this study is designed. Their job is not to go and try and catch fish necessarily. That would be what a rec angler would do. That would be what a charter captain would do. That would be what a commercial guy would do. We actually go out and target them. What DNR is doing is surveying the same areas consistently year after year, and the results are what they are. Those results don't directly say, okay, management do A, B, C, or X, Y, Z as far as regulatory action is concerned. They're one little piece of the puzzle. They're just that birth puzzle piece of the puzzle. And we know based on lots of other studies, especially tagging studies that help understand, tagging studies really help with migration patterns, but also mortality rates. That's some of the other stuff that's built into understanding whether these F numbers are right. And then we're going to show a biomass chart here in a second too. But the last point on this one real quick, F of 1, that's as much fishing mortality. It's all, 100% fishing mortality. We're catching the heck out of those fish. And you can see how steep that curve is. That we don't want that. We'd be taking too many animals if we had a fishing mortality about that high. I think our goal in straight bass right now is something like F of 0.17. So similar to that red curve. But again, this is meant to be generic in general. This is just meant to say, like, this is how it happens. The blue line's nature. The green line is us with our foot on the pedal as hard as we can put it.
All right, so let's see if the next slide makes me just as depressed. Here we go.
So this is F again. This is fishing mortality, and this is over time. And so the two lines are a threshold is the black line, the target is the dotted line. So we want to control fishing mortality, and you can see the numbers on the left side. They're hard to read, but they go from 0 up to 0.45. And like I said, the target is it is 0.17. The threshold is 0.20. We want to stay between those or below the target, and that's where we are right now. And you can see 2019 ADD 6. That's addendum 6. That was a management action taken by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which changed the regulations for 2020, and they're the current regulations we're fishing under. And so the goal was, once we were understood that our fishing mortality was too high, action was taken, it was reduced, and you can see it on this graph that it was reduced, and this goes through 2021. Unfortunately, in 2022, preliminary information showed a major spike in recreational fishing success. There's some other images that show this a little bit later, and so that's part of why we have a management action underway right now. And we're going to talk about public comment here shortly because folks can get involved in providing that public comment. But you can go ahead. So also in 2018, there was something called a benchmark stock assessment. It's a very, 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 very long document, 600 some pages. It is peer reviewed. And a benchmark stock assessment is an opportunity to bring new sources of information and kind of reset our opportunity to analyze the stock population. And with this last benchmark, new data related to recreational fishing activities drove the system that surveys us is called MRIP, MRIP, Marine Recreational Information Program. And so what that does is it's people out all over the place in the states. It's federally funded, but the states work in partnership with the feds, and they collect information. They may ask you questions at the dock. What did you catch? What were you targeting? What was your second most caught fish? So on and so forth. That helps them understand what your catch was if they intercept you, if they find you at the dock. Well, we know that this system doesn't work great in the Chesapeake Bay because there's 11,686 miles of shoreline. This system and the interviewers can only interview you at a public dock. And so it's a statistical model. It is built and it is sound statistically, but for many, many years now, people like me that get involved in this and also folks that are recreational fishing advocates or participants, they look at it and they say, there's no way this is accurate. The system is designed for coast-wide year-long analysis of recreational catch, but then there's also effort. So effort is how many days we're going, how many millions of us are pursuing striped bass up and down the Atlantic coast. And the way that effort is the way they find out about your effort is through a mail system. It used to be based on a coastal telephone book. And so they would actually call your home phone. I don't have one anymore. I haven't had one in years. And that was, so they used to call people. Hey, have you been fishing? No. Hung the phone up. All right. Call another person. Have you been fishing? No. Hang the phone up. So they weren't even calling like what we would consider the universe of anglers. And so an improvement was made. I can't remember when. And for a series of years, they did the old school call, but then they also updated a mail survey. The stuff, you ever see the thing where you get it in the mail, and it may have like a $2 bill in it? Mm-hmm. It's like, fill this out. Thank you. We're giving you a gift. Well, NOAA is not sending $2 bills, but they are sending something that is the effort survey. It's called the FES, Fishing Effort Survey. So leading into the benchmark stock assessment, it just so happened that MRIP, the system, was recalibrating. They were going from that phone system to a mail system. They're looking at the data, and they recalibrated all the stock assessments throughout the country. So this happened for lots of other species. And this is important because prior to this benchmark assessment, the actual numbers of fish, or in this case, it's shown in millions of pounds biomass, was actually a lower number of actual numbers of fish. And so when you update this statistical system, it actually scales our understanding of the population of fish, because the general logic is there's so many people out there fishing X number, and they're Y number are catching so many fish. And so we have this general understanding of catch and effort. But if so many people are, let's just say we go out there and we're catching 10 fish, well, we know for a fact that there's more than 10 fish. And so they use assumptions and other sources of data to try and estimate what the total number really is, but we don't know. So more recently, our understanding of the target and the threshold, which are also right here on this line, on this chart, we want to be at the dotted line with the population. We don't want to go below the black line, the solid line. That's our threshold. So this is actually the opposite of the F chart. The F chart, we want to stay below the lines. In this case, we want to be above them. And so I mentioned all that recalibration stuff because it totally changed our understanding of the actual numbers of fish in the population. It totally changed our understanding of the recreational fishing component of it. But in a fishery like striped bass, which has commercial and recreational fishing, what it did was it maintained a commercial quota at their pound level. And that poundage didn't change when our assumption about the population of the stock changed. In some fisheries, it automatically did. So like bluefish, flounder, black sea bass, with some of them, they went, wait, the population's so much bigger. There's so many fish. And the law says there's a certain balance of allocation between recreational and commercial. And so therefore, if the population's so much bigger, we got to give the commercial guys way more fish too. That's the only fair thing to do by the law. Well, many people were saying, whoa, 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 what if we're wrong? And the commercial fishery now catches those fish. And we find out under the next recalibration, we were way off, and now we've depressed that population so much. And that's been a concern of mine. It's been a concern of many, and it's relevant now because more recently, NOAA came out, the MRIP division, and they said some initial studies they've been doing to update their science, which is important. Their statistical program is always improving. That's why they did the recalibration. It's not a matter of right or wrong. This is what the data says. It's been peer reviewed. The scientists agree. So this is information that should guide management. It doesn't mean it's real. It's reality. It's our best guess. More recently, they said that depending how they structure the questions in the survey, in the FES, the effort survey, they're finding out that the ultimate result is way off, way different from one question set versus another. And so they said, as a blanket statement, that they were seeing 30 to 40% overestimation of effort in some fisheries. That is not information ready for us to manage by today. And more recently, we've been hearing that by like 2026, 2027, maybe even later, we'll start to manage based on that new assessment, because the MRIP folks are going to continue to test their methodology, test their numbers, and then go through their scientific process to advise fisheries management. And so the real take home is they increased the size of the numbers of fish in the population, which left commercial fisheries at their level. Now they're telling us that might have been an overestimation, but we didn't do a study specific to striped bass. So we're not telling you that you can manage based on that information. But me, as a manager, I go, oh, whoa, all along, I thought they were wrong. I don't think that's a reflection of reality. And now they're telling me I might have been right by not thinking that numbers are that high. But again, these are just things that weigh on your mind. And I think an important take home is for folks to realize that, science is science. There's nothing I can do or say that makes that different. I can't make new data available with the snap of my fingers. Neither can the federal government. It takes an inordinate amount of money, way more money than you can imagine, to try and count every fish caught or survey every recreational angler. And that's never going to happen. One last important point. There's a major difference between commercial fisheries and recreational, in that commercial fisheries are out there to catch the fish, to get paid. They want to be out on the water as limited time as possible, because time is money, whether it be fuel expense or whatever, their ability to do something else and make money. Or recreational, it's just that. We're inefficient. I saw somebody made a comment earlier that, they're terrible at fishing. Well, most recreational anglers are. And there's one simple multiplier that's mentioned in fisheries management. It's probably listed in that Management 101 link at ASMFC. And that's something called a catch per unit effort. That's what it comes down to. How successful are we? How much do we catch per the amount of time we put in? If this were waterfowl, if there was a 6-bird limit, I think a number I saw on like waterfowl hunter success was something like 0.9 ducks per hunt. And therefore managers know, well, if you can set the limit at 6, somebody might get lucky and get their 6 one day, but most of them are getting 0.9, not even a duck. And therefore there's that cushion, right? It's not that simple in fisheries, but that same concept rings true. We lock down certain components in fisheries and regulations. So like in the case of striped bass, a 1 fish limit, we know that no matter how much effort there is, a single individual can only take home 1 striped bass. And so that helps us understand what the potential removals are or harvest is from this population. And so last point on this slide here, SSB is spawning stock biomass. It is the female fish. And what this does is basically say to managers, okay, if we try and maintain a high biomass of fish up there at that dotted line, we know we're going to have highly abundant fisheries, which drive strong economies. makes people happy. They shop at tackle stores, they buy boats. Commercial fishermen are going to be successful as well. And in the case of striped bass, the black line here is actually the estimated level of population in 1995, because that was the year that the population was considered rebuilt. The dotted line is 125% of that.
Mm.
And so ultimately managers chose that. You can see by this chart here that we maintained it, above that 1995 level for quite some time. But as I mentioned earlier, CCA really started advocating in about 2013 or 2014 to say, hurry up, take some reductions, kill less fish, because we see it on the water. We're hearing from people that are seeing a decrease in population, a decrease in abundance. We're also seeing young of year not do as well as it was. And we're concerned that the level of commercial catch plus the level of recreational catch is way too high. And if you go back one slide real quick, this slide is the I told you so slide. Fishing mortality for all those years from 1995 through 2019 was higher than it should have been. But we only knew that once the 2018 benchmark assessment told us. So it's this constant jockeying of like what we think based on what does the science tell us? And then maybe the science can be updated and completely rewrite history, at least relatively speaking, because that's all this is. It's relatively speaking. So that's a lot. Sorry.
Good. No. It's and I wanted to hold this till after the show, but when Martin, Gary, and I were talking, one thing it seems like is, whether you believe in it or not, global warming, climate change, you are seeing the temperatures warm, and the canary in the coal mine is, this seems to be, anecdotally at least when I look online at pictures, the amount of puppy red drum and speckled trout and more tarpon we're seeing in the bay than ever before.
Yep.
And I feel like that has to be some kind of canary in the coal mine, is that there's a change happening to the bay where, when you guys are listening to this, we're not saying the bay is dead of life. There's something different happening now. Is that something you can speak to? Is that one of the bigger things that you're seeing, or what?
Absolutely. So climate has driven migration patterns of all living things forever. I mean, if you look back into just human existence, you think about indigenous populations throughout our country, they were nomadic, and they went to different places where food, shelter, and prevailing conditions existed for them. We build houses and heat them, and maybe that's part of climate change too. But ultimately, animals are out there and they can only exist in a prevailing condition that they need. And it's going to happen over time. We're going to see it happen over time. And frankly, we don't even understand, I believe we don't even truly understand like what the right scale is of change, especially nowadays. I mean, everything's instant for us, right? We want instant satisfaction, instant information, but we really don't know what nature's up to and what their scale is. I mentioned earlier that 30-ish year multi-decadal oscillation of the oceans. That's affecting those fish, but also just what's happening. And so we can measure dissolved oxygen, we can measure salinity, we can monitor our recent winter times, and all those things definitely relate to the prevalence of puppy drum, speckled trout, tarpon, pompano, sheep's head, lots of species that are typically a southern-ish species, at least from the Maryland perspective, are showing up. It's not the first time ever. There's a pound net on the wall. I'm sorry, there's a tarpon on the wall at a shop in Hooper Island that was caught in a pound net many years ago, and so it's not new that tarpon are showing up in Maryland's portion of the bay. It's just not as common as it has been recently. Take two other fish species that are missing: Atlantic croaker. We only see them at small stages and younger ones. They're not getting up to the nice big sizes that so many charter trips were fueled by, so many fishing trips are fueled by. And then you take the weak fish. Also a species, both species actually are managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. So if you want to see their stock assessments and their management stuff, it's on that website. Those are two species which are gone. And are they gone from a predator-prey relationship? Are they gone from taking too many out of a fishery? I mean, ultimately, yes, probably. We also have in the Chesapeake something that weighs on my mind a lot, which is the fact that blue catfish are everywhere, especially since 2018, right? 2018 into 19 was that cold, or the freshest period in Chesapeake Bay recorded history. for more than a calendar year, get what they called a freshet. That allowed blue cats to move. They've been seen reproducing on the upper bay. I think 2019 was the first time the young of year surveys saw young of year blue catfish. They're an apex predator. They're going to be eating young striped bass. They can absolutely have an impact on the abundance of young of year that DNR is sampling. Because if those young of year are being eaten by a big old blue cat at some point, they're not going to be surveyed, and therefore they're gone, right? And so there are all these correlations. But there's no question that whether it's from a direct impact from runoff, from pollutants, from that type of stuff that we're causing more and more each year, yet trying to fix, or these kind of global climate pieces that people are working towards fixing, but I think are much more out of our hands than stuff we can do on a local level.
Because I know you're seeing that the striped bass population is shifting farther north. And I mean, do you think at some point you're going to see Nova Scotia and the Bay of St. Lawrence become like a hotspot in 20 years for striper?
There's rivers up there that are already hotspots. I'm not up to speed on a lot of the more recent literature or data or studies on that kind of stuff about the genetics of those fish and so on and so forth. But there's no question that they're up there in a higher abundance than ever before. And they're missing from places as far south as like Cape Lookout, North Carolina. If we rewind to when the population was rebuilt in the late 90s, in the early 90s, North Carolina had a robust commercial fishery. They're not catching any fish at all, any of the Atlantic population. Virginia, I mean, remember the wintertime fisheries that were happening in Virginia. Unfortunately, at that time, so many people out of Virginia Beach were going over the 3 mile line out in the federal waters where you're not allowed to legally even pursue striped bass. That was happening. Unfortunately, what that meant from a management perspective was higher fishing mortality than what we put on paper and said was legal. People were out there killing fish, accessing fish that were just schooled up in the wintertime. And I mean, it was lights out fishing and killing fish that are 15 years or older. And so it takes like 15 years, right, for that fish to be replaced in the population. And so ultimately, as the population marched north, there's no question that the overwintering population of adult striped bass in the Atlantic has slowly but surely gone north. But we're also seeing gaps in the population too. So it's not just that Chesapeake fish aren't here, they're elsewhere, and the total population's the same. It's that it's starting to really show itself in the Chesapeake that there's less and less. We've already seen that signal march its way south or north from the south over the last 20 plus years. And unless things turn around, the Chesapeake may be the next North Carolina, where North Carolina has its own little small population of Roanoke and Albemarle Sound fish. But even that is in moratorium, or might as well be, because it's not doing well. So bottom line is we don't know, but you can see these correlations and see these changes and definitely observe that less fish are being spawned out of the striped bass. Out of the Chesapeake. And if I'm not mistaken, it's somewhere between 70 to 90% of the population is estimated to have been born in Maryland waters over time. Now, if you did that simple analysis right now, those little tiny young year bars would tell you that a very small percentage of fish are coming out of Maryland. The Hudson, thankfully, is picking up the slack.
Yeah.
You can't take a place that's 70 to 90% historically and replace it overnight. So we're seeing this restriction of population, restriction of range. They're popping up in Canada, which is definitely that northward movement. The bottom line is it's this crazy kind of amoeba that's moving, and we can do our best to try and understand what's really happening.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. And again, like the next 10, 20 years to see what kind of data comes out with the Canadian population, and will it just reestablish itself and then it just shifts northward, or is this something even worse?
Right. That previous slide real quick, let me explain it. This would be helpful for people to understand who catches what. This is numbers of fish. This is removals, which is both harvest and then fish that die that are bycatch or not kept. Live releases is the big number that we look at in recreational fishing. And if you take the total live releases that are estimated to have been released by the MRIP system or other systems that may supplement MRIP, ultimately they take that number and they multiply it by 0.09%, and that number is the purple, the top section on this big blob here. And so we assume 9% of live released fish year-long coast-wide in the recreational fishery die, or the way I prefer to look at it is 91% live. This could be as low as less than 1% of fish dying, and it could be as high as 40 or 50%, depending on the prevailing conditions, because we know that a striped bass prefers a temperature range from about 60 to 80 degrees. And once you get above that, they really start dying from release mortality and dying just from being in bad conditions. When the water is warm, the molecules are further apart. It's harder for them to breathe. And the reason little fish live in the estuary where those types of conditions will exist, warm waters, low oxygen, is because the younger fish are much better at processing the oxygen out of the water, because the ability for their gills to work compared to their body needs is much better. That's no different than the difference between like me at 41 and my son at 5. There's certain systems in his body which are operating way more efficiently than they are in mine after all the abuse I put my body through, right? And so those big fish, they only come in the spring to spawn, and then they get back back to the ocean, where ideally that perfect temperature range is something they can find, and then that food is something else that can exist. And so these numbers are coast-wide. The green is estimated harvest, and harvest is a bit more than discards or release mortality. And then ultimately down at the bottom there, you see the commercial piece where it's harvest and then a thin layer of discards. There's been a lot of conversation around commercial discards recently, but we really don't have the numbers I think we should have. We definitely know that anchored gill nets, which are used in the wintertime in Virginia, like I mentioned earlier, they have a high discard mortality rate, and a lot of fish are getting caught in those. That said, the fishermen are tending the nets, killing illegal fish, taking them off the market, and we really don't know what's getting lost in those fisheries. But it's an estimate. And this does, again, show the scale of recreational fishery to commercial, a new perspective of that scale since 2018. It used to be closer together in who makes up what percentage.
Guys, again, please like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out in the algorithm. I'm going to link everything in the episode description. And then you guys have your questions, keep holding it. I got like a stack of gift cards that I have to be giving out here. Let's get into, because this thing's getting pretty backlogged. We have Brandon that says, what is going on with the menhaden in the bay?
Glad you mentioned that. So, of course, menhaden are often referred to as the most important fish in the sea. A longtime naturalist at Chesapeake Bay Foundation who's been made an admiral of the Chesapeake is a gentleman named John Page Williams. And he's a native Virginian. We borrowed him for a long time in Maryland, and he's back in Virginia and still just a tremendous resource. But the way he simply described menhaden was, they're a magical fish that turns sunlight into whale food. They literally graze on algae, a plant fueled by the sun and nutrients in the water. These fish get in these big schools that all anglers know about, right? They have their mouths open and they sit there and eat the algae. Well, whales eat them, stripers eat them, ospreys eat them, lots of things eat them. And so in management, more recently, menhaden are actually the first species, which is managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, to use what's called an ecosystem-based approach or ecosystem modeling, and trying to determine how many we should kill, how many fish we can take out of the system and maintain some balance in the ecosystem. That is based off of studies that showed direct correlation between striped bass success and menhaden abundance. We know that menhaden are extremely valuable to the striped bass, and they definitely are at certain parts of their life cycle and certain areas. Menhaden are also a species that's assessed coast-wide. Different than striped bass, they spawn in the ocean, and their larvae are pushed into the estuary where they grow up. And so that's why earlier in the year, you'll hear guys start talking about peanut bunker. They're the little guys. They're just born, small, and they're perfect. They're little protein-packed little Snickers bars for everything out there. But they're a perfect way to keep striped bass healthy in the estuary. Well, over time, relatively speaking, on very similar surveys like the Young of Year, they're seeing that there's been a bit of a flat line over really the last 20 plus years of the abundance of menhaden in the bay in some of these surveys. And so what that tells us is that the currents that push the young larvae into the estuary may not be doing the same thing that they used to do. And so we're observing less small menhaden in the bay than before. And so then on the management side of things, there was, of course, there's pound net fisheries in the bay. There's some gill net fisheries in the bay that take a very small percentage of the overall take. But then there's omega protein, the big reduction fishery, which I think right now is like 79% of the coastwide harvest is being taken by the one company because they are the last participant in the reduction fishery. Reduction meaning catch them in big purse seine vessels with the aid of the aid of airplanes, looking for the schools of fish, trying to see if they're really big ones, because the factory trawlers really want the big fish. That's their most efficient way to get their catch. And they operate in the Chesapeake, and they operate in Virginia waters, some out in federal waters, and nearly every state on the Atlantic coast now has actually banned their operation within state waters, which is within 3 miles. And so the overall coastwide population is considered to be healthy. Just like striped bass, it has moved north. The center of menhaden is wintering off of Jersey. It's wintering off like the mouth of the Hudson. I talked to guys last week that are catching, I think he said they caught like 35 stripers from about 18 pounds to 35 pounds. And they caught them on 2 mile long schools of menhaden.
My God. What's taking its place then as the primary bait fish or forage in the bay then?
That's the problem. I used to describe it as it's kind of like, let's say you're working late, you have nothing in the fridge, and so you're just gonna, oh God, I gotta go out and find something to eat. But as you go down the road, all the restaurants are closed. You're kind of stuck with the one that's open, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's ultimately what has happened. We've taken a highly abundant prey species that so many animals rely on. They're not as prevalent as they used to be. That could be natural conditions, but it's also how many you take, because nature would have them all if we didn't take them, right? And so it's kind of those two pieces of the puzzle, but ultimately the restaurants are closing for the striped bass. Many believe that this could relate to the weak fish situation. Weak fish are a prey species for lots of different animals. I know dolphins eat them, striped bass eat them. I talked to guys back in the old days that used to love live lining small weak fish for stripers. And so I think that's ultimately, it's all these other things that are still on the menu: crabs, bay anchovies, and what's the other one? I'm having a dumb attack here. The other
Shrimp.
Well, there's shrimp too. Actually, shrimp are there's a trawl fishery in the ocean in Virginia. There's a trawl fishery now opening up in the ocean in Maryland for shrimp. I know guys cast netting for shrimp in some of the lower Eastern Shore rivers over the last many years. I know guys catching them in pound nets. So that's a new forage base. So the bottom line is these animals are going to live all over the place. And over time, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, the Menhaden Board, they did enact this ecosystem-based management, which just says take less fish because we want, ultimately we want to leave them out there for these important prey or predators that eat them. And so over that time period, the total allowable catch coastwide has gone up and down. But more recently, the Chesapeake Bay cap, which is not directly based on biological data, it's more of a management tool saying we think it's best to cap the catch in the bay. That cap has been placed at 51,000 metric tons, which is like, I don't know, 125 million fish or something like that. Menhaden on their size. So that's one conservation measure that's in place that I don't believe is enough. It needs to be reduced. Because if you have less menhaden in the bay, you should be taking less because the remainder is what nature gets. And so, unfortunately, there's a lot of politics at play there. And ultimately, the state of Virginia gets to determine who catches what in their state waters. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission determines what is the coastwide level of catch, which is acceptable, and then what do the states get from an allocation perspective. And so, this is another one of these things that never happens fast enough. When we see the writing on the wall, we know that this is an important forage species, but politically, it's very difficult to make changes. And if you flip to the other side of things, you take a place like Reedville, Virginia, where the Omega factory is, and there's lots of jobs created there. There's folks working in the vessels, working in the reduction fishery. Some of them are seasonal jobs. Some of them leave when the fishery is not open, like in the wintertime, go down to the Gulf. This fishery also exists in the Gulf, and it's also a hot topic for CCA down there, and a great coalition of groups. There's some fantastic people in Virginia, boots on the ground. Virginia Saltwater Sport Fishing Association has been doing a lot on the Menhaden front. CCA Virginia is getting more active again on this front, but I'd almost describe it as like a Cold War of sorts in the fisheries conservation world, us versus them in many ways. And it's one of those things that we wish we could solve more quickly, because we know that food supports a whole ecosystem that we believe is more valuable to the country if those fish are left in the water, and all the different predator species that rely on them are the ones that we go out and catch.
And that's some really good stuff. And guys, again, please, I'm going to ask one more. I'm going to let you guys ask one more question here. Then we're going to get back to the PowerPoint presentation. Guys, keep putting your questions in the comment, and then at the end, I'll be pulling the best ones out to win a gift card. Here's another one that just won a gift card. David Williams asked a really good question. It kind of ties into what we're talking about. Would it have a big impact on the positive side of the fishery if there was an absolute catch and release only for one full year, or no fishing for them at all for 1 year? Would folks stand for that? David, again, guys, for everyone that want a gift card, email me at fishingdmv.com, Instagram, Facebook. Just get a hold of me. David, you just want a gift card to Chick-fil-A.
Love it. So ultimately what you're saying is that we turn fishing mortality to zero. And at least if we said no fishing. Now, in a place like Chesapeake Bay, it's pretty tough to go out there and fish areas that I fish and not catch striped bass. You can, even with a depressed population, they're out there. So ultimately, you're going to have some sort of mortality if fishing is allowed. How do we measure it? Do we know what it is? To me, it's a very small amount. During the 1980s moratorium, there was targeting allowed. So we talk about catch and release as either targeting or non-targeting. Maryland is one of the first to implement a non-targeting closure that was done in the summertime. It's still in place. And the idea there was that we're saving the fish that would have been harvested on paper. We're also saving the fish that would have died from release mortality on paper. That's how the management action is done. The exact reality of what happens on water, well, you've got to let time go by and then kind of look backwards, and that adjusts the whole assessment. And so there's this whole disconnect that always happens. To me, 1 year would never be enough. What you would be doing is protecting a year class, but right now we don't have year classes. And so you almost don't need to close fishing when their abundance gets low enough that people aren't successful at fishing. And so that's the difference, very different. Again, the difference between commercial fishing and recreational. Commercial is going to be able to catch their quotas, catch their limits, be successful longer than recreational as you have a population decline. One, they're much better at fishing. Their gear is way more efficient. And that's just a reality. And so there's lots of different ways to attempt to manage it. And the bottom line is, if you don't kill fish, they're going to be out there. Nature's going to be killing them anyway. But if we take off our fishing mortality, then there's going to be a more rapid increase. We're going to see a more rapid increase in abundance. And one way I like to describe catch and release mortality is talking about a largemouth bass fishery. And we've seen this evolution of the largemouth bass fishery happen over the last 50, 60 years in this country, where it used to be harvest, stringers full. It quickly has evolved. And even today, the way tournaments are being run in a way so that there is not mortality as best we can, weighing them on the boat and releasing them right away, rather than pulling them together at a scale. But ultimately, if you look at the largemouth bass fishery, all of the fishing mortality is largely coming from releasing. And so what triggered a lot of concern about striped bass recreational release mortality was that in 2018, when that stock assessment came out, it showed that like 48% of total fish killed that we believe were killed, total removals, about 48% were from recreational discard mortality. And many people go, oh, no, that's a big problem. It's a big problem. to me, I thought about it, and I thought about the bass fishery, and I thought through it, and I went, well, I also thought about my own personal use of striped bass. That gets to a certain point where um, you want to go fishing more than you may want to take home fish. In some cases, that happened to me personally. I would always take home fish if they were bleeding in the gills or I thought they weren't going to survive. I would go prepared to take home fish, but a good day for me could be, catching a dozen, catching 30. I know full well that does kill fish, right? But it's 91% of the fish that I catch survive versus 0% of my limit, right? So there's these trade-offs, and there's this like cultural shift, just like what's happened in the largemouth bass fishery. I've been witnessing in the striped bass fishery. Lots of people are pivoting away from targeting them in the summertime because hot water means they're going to die when you release them.
Like muskie.
Yeah. There's guys pivoting away from live bait fisheries. We put circle hooks in place coast-wide. If live or dead bait is used in a striped bass fishery coast-wide, it must be a non-offset circle hook. And so there's these little things we can do to make incremental changes, whether they show up on the management radar. We could debate that all day long. But the reality is there's all these different things that need to happen. I can't remember what the question was. Did I answer it completely?
Yeah, you did. And this one just ties into it. Jay Cotter, they need to treat it like Florida does for snook, smaller slots and shorter season. And that question, guys, really puts something in my mind. Will we ever see the cultural shift to where you see it with the sailfish and things like that, where culturally you just do not want to eat them? It becomes more of a trophy sports fish. No one wants to eat a tarpon. Is that a cultural shift that we could possibly see, or should we see?
So I'd answer the should we see first, and the answer is definitively no. I believe this is a public resource. We should be able to manage it so that the public can access it. And if that means bring it home to eat it, it's a resource. Use it. We don't grow forests to not cut them down and then build things with the wood and then regenerate that forest, regenerate habitat, which we find out is actually great for the wild things, right? Diversity and habitat. So these things are resources that we should be using. I actually tell people all the time, and I think it's in Genesis in the Bible, man and woman shall have dominion over all God's creatures. And so there's this spiritual piece, for Judeo-Christianity. There's also a legal component of the public trust and what it means to have a public trust resource going back to the Roman Empire. Emperor Justinian first said that the seas, the shores of the sea, the water, the air is common to everyone. And I think that was in about the year, his reign was about the 520s. So it's not new that this idea is that this is a resource, we can use it. It's perfectly acceptable for people to use it as a more renewable resource by releasing it. But that's not any better than somebody harvesting the fish in my mind, because who am I to say, A, that you must kill a fish? And how dare I force somebody that would prefer to release them to kill one? That's not for me to say. And then on the flip side, if the population allows it and the prevailing regulations allow it, somebody should be able to take them home for food. And if management gets it right, there should be commercial fisheries. I should be able to go to my local seafood market and have the Maryland state fish available to me. Unfortunately, management fails time and time and time again. And it's usually when they try and pick that one user or the way that any individual may use a fish and make them win. And again, I'm fluid. I'm a commercial fisherman's client for certain species. I personally don't purchase commercial striped bass. It's just my choice. But lots of other fish I buy commercially. So that's my way as a public accessing that species. I may go out and fish for it myself. That's my way of accessing it. Or I could hire somebody that's a professional captain to take me out and probably guarantee I'm going to be a lot more successful on their boat than I would on a pier, a beach, or my boat. And so there's all these different ways to access it. And I'm not a big believer in locking people out. I think there needs to be balance. But when the population suffers, that's when tough decisions need to be made. And that's when you can't leave people out.
Guys, again, ask a question, win a prize. That's how this works. Ask a question, win a prize. Let's get back to this PowerPoint so we're not here till 2 in the morning. Wives will not be happy with that.
Go to 14, go to slide 14 real quick, because this relates to the snook question. And so slots. A slot is used so that you know the age class of fish you're exploiting, you're allowed to take, and the age classes of fish you're trying to protect. And for years, we did not have that in the coastwide striped bass fishery. But when preliminary 2022 landings data came in at the end of 22, early 23, the commission, led by a commissioner from Massachusetts named Dr. Mike Armstrong, one of the folks that works at Mass Department of Marine Fisheries, Mass DMF, is one of the top striped bass scientists that helps, their shop helps run a lot of the data and do a lot of analysis. And so what Dr. Armstrong said was, I got my guys back at the lab doing some calculations. And if we kill as many fish in 23 as we think we did in 22, we're going to have a serious problem on our hands. And so that's why the emergency action was put in place to make the coastal limit 28 to 31 inches, the slot limit. And then ultimately it affected the Chesapeake Bay fisheries, where in Maryland we have a 19-inch minimum and now a 31-inch maximum. And so what that's doing is, like you see on the screen, that's saying that the reason that spike happened in catch was the 2015 year class was the last big year class. And those fish stayed in state waters, they stayed close to the shore, and were highly accessible to anglers throughout like the Hudson Bight. So like the mouth of the Hudson, North Jersey, kind of all the way out in southern New England out to Massachusetts. And so there was a high abundance of fish. There was a spike in mortality. And managers said, you know what? How big of the 2015 year class? This data was shown to us that says, okay, they're 8 years old. They're on average 31.6 inches. So managers said, you know what? We're going to stop catching fish above 31 inches legally. We're going to stop killing them. And now any fish that are 8 and older, the way that they would die legally would either be in commercial fisheries that have no max size limit, or some of these fish would die after being released. And so we just shifted the place that we're focusing our fishing mortality. Preliminary numbers right now for the 2023 fishery, when these rules were enacted for, are showing us that it worked and that we've kind of held the line and we've reduced fishing mortality in a meaningful way. Where the addendum 2, which is the action that the commission's working on right now and the public comment that's coming up is all about, and we have some slides on, addendum 2 is saying, hey, we still need to reduce fishing mortality or removals, total number of fish removed, by 14.5% coast-wide, no matter who's getting, killing less fish. We need 14.5% less fish removed, and only then might we rebuild the biomass and the population up to the level we want by 2029, which was that 10-year rebuilding plan that was triggered back in 2019. And so slots are really valuable, but there's another way of showing this, actually. If you go down to slide 16, this is from the previous stock assessment. So this is not current through today's data, but this doesn't change much. This is the proportion of what age fish are caught in what fisheries. And so technically, if you add up all the gray bars, all those gray bars proportion number on the left will equal a total of 100%. And so in the case of this one, like number 5, the one that sticks up the most, what's that? 22% of the estimated recreational catch in the Chesapeake Bay are age 5 fish. Now, and like 21% are age 4. Some of them are age 3. Now, again, this is older data, so it might have been based on different size limits, but we know that a 19-inch fish, our minimum size, this time of year, could be a legal fish, a 3-year-old, a legal 3-year-old. I explain it as kind of like the tall kids in the class. They may have grown fast enough that by the fall of their 3rd season, they're legal. We catch them, we kill them. So the darker lines here just show you that the ocean fishery is catching slightly older fish, and it's also related to the size limit, which is legal, and the size limit's always been a 28-inch minimum on the coastal fisheries, at least in recent history. So we have this different kind of what they call selectivity, or what are the prevailing regulations allow us to take from the fishery from a harvest perspective. And then the next slide down, number 17, is actually the removals, and you'll see how the bars shift here as we switch to it. So notice the bars got taller in the younger year classes. And that goes right back to those exponential decay curves. In fact, this trend here kind of looks like that exponential decay. There's more fish available the moment they're born in that year class than there's ever going to be again. And so in the Chesapeake Bay, some of our fisheries do interact, per this data, with age 1 fish. More of our fisheries interact with age 2. The most of the fish that we interact with are age 3, all of which we have to release because this is recreational release. So it's what's available to you is what you're going to catch is the bottom line with fishing. And so when you're in a spot catching a bunch of rats, that's what's there. They're probably a little bit faster to get to your bait than the bigger ones. The big ones are probably there too, just not in as high of abundance because unfortunately they've started dying.
And guys, I see the comment section is absolutely getting flooded here. We're going to finish up this slide show, and then we're going to kind of try to get to them all, so we can actually don't want to be too long here today, guys. So, what is the next slide you'd like us to get to?
You can jump into that one right there.
18. Okay.
Yeah. So I mentioned the addendum. I think a little bit is cut off there, but that's okay. So what ended up happening last Wednesday is we had a straight bass board meeting. We had a document called Draft Addendum 2 that we had been working through, and we could have released it in the previous meeting back in August, but decided to give the technical advisors another chance to recalculate some stuff, present different options to us as board members. And then ultimately last week's meeting was about trying to cut back the options to ones that we think we would like to implement. And so they were looked at as Chesapeake Bay options and coastal options, because that's the way we're managing, as what they call two different fleets or two different groups of commercial and recreational fishermen operating in the bay versus the coast. So I brought up the bay ones first. This is what's on the table right now as a draft measure that we could choose to implement in the 2024 fishing season. And that is so we can reduce removals by 14.5% across all fisheries. So these are the rec fishing options. You start at option D1 through D4. The only differences between option D1 and D4 is the max size limit. So you can see from 19 to 23, 19 to 24, 19 to 25, 19 to 26. Those are different slots. That's the only thing that changes. The bag limit is the same, 1 fish for all modes. In Maryland, that would actually be a change because right now, if you fish on a charter boat that participates in an electronic reporting program, you can keep 2 fish, where if you fish on your own boat or on shore, you can catch 1 fish. In the options in the E section, you can see that reflected in the bag limit. And so there were other options. I think A was status quo, no changes at all. You'll always see that in a fisheries management plan change. They always start with that as one baseline. Status quo, don't change anything. So that remains in the document as option A. The board chose to remove options B and C. That's why they're not up here on the screen. They're gone. So the public will now get to comment on D1 through 4 or E1, E2. E3 and E4 were removed by the board, largely because if you look over to the third to last column, the overall reduction is what we're looking at. Our goal is 14.5%. And so E3 and E4 don't get anywhere near it. There's a 7% and a 5.1% overall reduction. If you look at E2, there's only an 11% reduction, so that's probably not going to cut it either. And then if you look at E1, you've got a 17.9% reduction, and all of these are the percentage reduction for the recreational fishery in the Chesapeake. The addendum does show that if you reduce recreational fisheries by 16.1%, that's the same thing as reducing all fisheries by 14.5. The reason I don't trust that, I spoke about earlier. I think that the numbers of fish and the scale of the recreational fishery by numbers of fish is not as high as we say. That relates back to that scaling and recalibration and MRIP stuff. And so I don't trust personally that these numbers are accurate to what's actually happening in the water. I do trust the science. I know this is all reliable, good information done by really smart people. But when I weigh all the different pieces of the puzzle, not just this data, my gut tells me that we're not actually getting a 17.9% reduction if we were to choose option E1. We're getting less. And then my gut also tells me be more conservative. So Not every board member thinks that way, especially those that work on behalf of a state Department of Natural Resources. They have all stakeholders to consider, and therefore they're going to try and find that exact number that makes it work for everybody, which in theory is 14.5%. Just to switch up, or as I mentioned, the difference in bag limit in options E, I oppose options E across the board. If the vote was right now, I'd be very vocal in opposition to them, because what that would do is it allows 2 fish per person on a for-hire vessel. That's what FH stands for. So if you can pay to go out on a charter boat, you get to keep 2 fish. Again, that's happening in Maryland, but if option E was passed, that would now be allowed in the Potomac River, and that would now be allowed in Virginia waters. Doesn't take an expert to understand that killing 2 fish is twice as many as 1 fish. And that's the specific reason why I don't accept it. A, it's not acceptable to give different people different rules. I mean, we have something in our Constitution called the Equal Protections Clause. If you look at our fisheries management plan law in the state of Maryland, it's very similar to most states, and it says fair and equitable. It should be reasonably calculated to provide conservation, and it shouldn't be based on economic benefit of one particular group. Unfortunately, during the Hogan administration, Maryland DNR put in rules that did just that. 2 fish for some, 1 fish for everybody else. They pretended it was conservation, but what it meant was that those that fish on charter boats aren't reducing their catch during a time period when back then we're supposed to be reducing catch by 18%. So you'll hear me again be vocal about the D options. There was some discussion about removing option D3, option D4 because of that 11 or that 12.1%, that 10.3%, which would just not fit, not work. Last point on this, and we'll go to the next one. If you look in the far right-hand column, that's recreational release mortality change. And so you also see harvest change. So just like D1, if you tighten up the slot a lot, take the upper size limit from 31 where it is now, and only been there for 1 year, take it from 31, drop it all the way down to 23. What the model is doing is going, okay, they can't harvest all those other fish now that go from 23 inches to 31. So what percent savings is that based on what we think harvest is right now? And the answer is 38.4%. Now, if you take all those fish and multiply 9% mortality, because that's the release mortality year-long fishery-wide, we think that release mortality is going to go up by 6.7%. And so the combined change for overall removals is that overall removals will reduce by 22.4%. That's the information the public's going to see. Again, E3 and E4 are not going to be there when you see them come out in the draft addendum. That addendum should be out in the next week or so. The commission staff is putting that together. And then you'll see a series of virtual meetings that'll happen across the Atlantic coast, and you can participate in any of them. And that's where I encourage folks, with the information you've learned tonight and will continue to learn, because CCA is putting together an angler's guide to Addendum 2 to make sure folks really understand what their comments are all about and that they're backed by the information in the document. I'll just one more thing about menhaden. Quite often people just say, well, if we did X to menhaden, it'll solve the striped bass problem. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. There's a definite connection. More menhaden's gonna absolutely equal success for striped bass, but we don't have the tools to just make that change immediately. That might take 30 years if we just stopped harvesting menhaden to see striped bass respond. We know it would happen, but there's so many other pieces to that equation: climate change, weather, etc. So it's not that simple. My point is, when you're commenting on a striped bass document like Addendum 2, focus on the options. That's what I, as a manager, want to hear from you. I want to hear the reasons why. I absolutely want to hear that menhaden is a part of the reason you believe this, but it's not that simple. We have to kill less striped bass, period. That's where we are. Next slide should be commercial. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong screen, the one that's not changing on my side. So zoom in to the bottom section here, those bigger blocks, because that's what's most important. That's the Chesapeake. Can you zoom in on those? There you go. Scroll up a little bit. Sorry, the other way. There you go.
Oh,
Whoop.
Jesus. All right, let's try it again.
Change
There
the
we go.
slides.
Right there.
A little bit more. Right there. Okay. So again, coastal fleet, Chesapeake fleet. The Chesapeake fleet is the bottom section here. Maryland does have a commercial fishery on the coast. You can see that a couple boxes up. 74,000 pounds and change, 24-inch minimum. That's what they catch. It's a gillnet fishery. Virginia has a coastal fishery as well. So back when Addendum 6 was put in place, back in 2019, to lower fishing mortality, Maryland, Potomac River Fisheries, and Virginia was supposed to reduce commercial removals by 18%. And so the way that works is they would take the quota, which is the number like the 2.588, that's a quota number. The 3.001, that's a quota number. The 2.556, that's quota numbers. I'm going to explain what those all mean because I still have the top of the chart here. But ultimately, what should have happened was that the baseline commercial quota in 2019 should have been reduced 18% in all three jurisdictions. In Maryland, it was reduced by 1.8%. In the Potomac, it was reduced by 1.8%. And in Virginia, I have my notes here. In the Chesapeake, it was reduced by 9.8%. And on the coast by 7.7. None of those are 18. So previous leaders, in the face of a need to reduce fishing mortality, chose not to. That's a mistake. They also chose to allow some people to keep a 2-fish limit in Maryland. Again, not reducing fishing mortality. That's a mistake. So all that means is that our fishing mortality curve in the Chesapeake stayed steeper than it should have. It stayed steeper than the coastwide body agreed to. It stayed steeper than science said we should have. And so in the board meeting the other day, I said, all we're doing is racing to the bottom and just deciding how steep we want our dive to be, which couldn't be more true if you're looking at that exponential curve, right? The steeper it is, the faster we're killing fish. So your leaders in Richmond, in Annapolis, or more specifically, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission and Maryland DNR, ultimately they made that decision for you and your fish back in 2019. Those were previous governors. The current governors now have the opportunity to fix that. I don't think anybody in fisheries management wants to go back necessarily, at least the folks that work for the state, because the folks that work for the state don't want to tell commercial fishermen, we're taking away your quota. In our Chesapeake Bay jurisdictions, we have something called an individual transferable quota. And so a portion of the quota is actually assigned to an individual. That individual is given tags and their annual allocation. And so in their business, they know they're going to catch X number of fish. In Maryland, no individual can have more than 2% of the total. It's actually supposed to be 1%. But ultimately, if I was buying quota from you, I could say, let's say I have like 0.9% of the total, and I buy your 1%. Now I can have 1.9 because the law says in my last transfer or my last purchase of quota from another individual, I'm effectively buying your license, that my percentage can now be up to 2%. It can't be 2%, but it can be 1.99999. And so in theory, in Maryland, you could assign the entire commercial fishery to 51 people. And so now you're assigning this public resource to people, and that creates a precedent that's very hard to unpack. One of the reasons that the individual transferable quota system was put into place was because what happened before then was called a derby fishery. And so the states would open the fishery on a certain date. Everybody goes out there and catches as many as they can. The first folks getting fish to market are going to make the most. But with the way supply and demand works, if you flood the market with a ton of fish because the season opened, well, the price is going to go down. And now you're not utilizing that resource for the benefit of the nation, the benefit of the state, the benefit of your local economy the way you could. So over this long time period, you've seen a lot of different commercial fisheries shift into this, which in theory is easier to manage. It's technically safer for the fishermen. They're not going to rush out into bad weather. and they can have more balance across their year. And so what typically happens in ITQ fisheries is we see a quota underage, or the fishermen are not catching the quota completely. In recent history, fisheries are performing somewhere about the 95% of their quota being caught. So what we're looking at here is, in this document, we have the quota is that 2.588. That is the Chesapeake Bay quota for the 3 jurisdictions to use. Maryland has the most of that. And I think Virginia's portion of that's like 985,000, and the Potomac River is 600,000 or so. I'm not doing quick math, but I think Maryland's is like 1.4 million. Ultimately, those are the numbers that we need to see reduced by, in theory, 14.5% to do right by the resource and to lower fishing mortality. Well, if you lower the quota by 14.5%, you're not even going to get to you're not actually going to save any fish. So the maximum quota, I should have been working off the 3 million number, because that's the actual quota assigned to the Chesapeake. There's this system where you can actually say, okay, because of the size fish I'm catching, my poundage is going to be different. It's something called conservation equivalency. You can see that off the bottom part of the screen. It's too complicated to explain. But right now, if there's no reduction in commercial fisheries in the Chesapeake Bay, that 3 million number is the actual correct number. If you reduce it by 14.5%, you're going to get that 2.566 million, right? 2,566,409. That's the 14.5% reduction. So what the board is looking at is going, okay, those are the two options there, somewhere between the 300 million and 2.566. The far right column, far right, is the 2022 commercial harvest. And so if you look right now, what's on the table is reducing by as much as 14.5%. 14.5% quota reduction is 2.566. Actual landings last year were 2.483. So even if you set the quota for next year's fishery at the 2.566, which is a 14.5% reduction, you're not saving any fish, because they actually caught about a 15% reduction last year, that 2.483. Does that make sense after all this talking? It makes no sense in reality, but that's what we're being presented with. And I've made this argument at the board the last couple meetings, and it became very apparent that from a technical perspective, the commission would not just reduce landings, the harvested fish. They control quota. I don't agree with the reasoning behind it, because in the end, the state of Maryland, the state of Virginia, and then collectively at the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, they can tomorrow, they could close the commercial fisheries in both states. And that would save 2.4 million, or whatever that number is right there. And they could do that. It does not require the ASMFC to tell them to do it. Governor Moore, Governor Youngkin could direct their agencies to get it done. And so they quite often in this system, you obviously don't want to take away from the people that elected you or that you work on behalf of. Like I said earlier, in a perfect world, there is a commercial fishery. There is a recreational fishery. There's people can catch and release. There's people that can harvest. Well, we've quickly realized we're not in a perfect world in the striped bass world. So in the end, we've kind of talked through some of this stuff before, but these are the ways we can control fisheries. And what's on the table right now are those decisions. And so, like I said, later this month, folks are going to be able to comment. The specific comments for the Chesapeake are going to be focused on options D and options E. And then the specific comments for the commercial side, that's recreational, will be somewhere between 0 and 14.5% quota reduction. Yet I'm going to be encouraging people to tell state leaders, reduce from landings. And that's why the statement I released on behalf of CCA regarding this addendum, and what I'm going to be talking about a lot in a more condensed format moving forward, is addendum 2 is not going to cut it. It's not going to save the number of fish we need to save in order to send us off into the trajectory of rebuilding the fishery population. And that's just the harsh reality of where we are right now. And that's strictly because we have poor young of year and nature is not providing more fish out into the water.
Oh my goodness, guys. I mean, bleak as shit. So let me give some stuff away to make myself feel better at least. Good God. Thank God I'm not drinking tonight. Carter J, you just want a gift card to Chick-fil-A. Again, email me at fishingthedmv@gmail.com, Instagram, Facebook. Question, you got 2 questions here, so I'm going to get them back to back. I'm in Nova, and in my local grocery store, what often have smaller rockfish for sale, 18 to 22 inches. Where would you think these fish are coming from?
Yep. So right on the screen right now, you can see that there's an 18-inch minimum in the Maryland Chesapeake Bay. There's an 18-inch minimum Potomac River. There's an 18-inch minimum Virginia. And so it could come from any 3 of those jurisdictions. And then North Carolina had a smaller gillnet fishery on their inland waters. I'm not sure if that still exists because what we're looking at here is all the big ocean-going fish. And so I have seen tags of smaller North Carolina fish is the reason I mentioned that. Ultimately, there's going to be a tag on that fish if it's still the whole animal. It'll be through its mouth. Each year, they're a different color, and printed on that tag, it could be, like in Maryland, I think it says MDITQ-SB. It may even be as specific as the type of gear. It could say like gillnet fishery versus pound net fishery versus hook and line. I can't remember. It's been some time since I've seen one. But ultimately, that tag is going to have that information. That tag is for traceability. And quite often, some restaurant or some grocery stores will promote, this is a local fish, this is fresh, it's not frozen, those types of things. And so that information should be right in front of you on that tag. And if you don't see it, because maybe it's a fillet or a core of a fish where the head's been cut off, you can ask, and they should have those tags because that tag's got to stay on that fish until it's ultimately processed down to the end user.
Good stuff. I think, guys, it's that easy. Just ask a question. You win a prize here. Carter J, again, joined late. Have you all talked about the net spills?
Yeah, so you're talking probably about the omega net spills. That's where we got to see a lot last year. What we know happens all the time in a purse seine fishery. That's why CCA believes that fishery should not be operating in the bay. I think their nets, if I'm not mistaken, are something like 60 feet tall. If they were fully scoped out, from lead on the bottom to floats on top, it might be less. There's actually a number of petitions and other things going on in Virginia right now. There's even a lawsuit about whether or not Virginia is properly managing the fishery resources for the benefit of the public. And so those net spills are either the nets being torn on the bottom or caught on the bottom and open up so the fish can come out. When they purse that purse seine up against the big hull and suck them out with a vacuum cleaner, those fish are going to be dead anyway. And so if they spill over, you're going to see them in the tide line. That's pretty common. But the real big one that stood out was the red drum net spills. Red drum, as we see, if you're pursuing them in recent years out in the Chesapeake, you'll find those big old schools, looks like a pumpkin patch. If you get lucky, you find them. And well, whether you see them or not in those big red drum schools, that's how they hang out. They're in here spawning. They're in here feeding on menhaden. And so if a net comes in, the airplane sees that big old school of fish, that purse seine circles around, those red drum have got to get out of that net quick enough. And the nets aren't designed that way. The nets are not designed to allow animals to release out of them. They circle them, they cinch them, they pull them up, and whatever's in there is going to be dead. And so we got to see firsthand that there's a lot of redfish. There's no doubt there's marine mammal impacts. There's reports on that that are out there. There's also things like sharks and other important predatory species, maybe cobia. During the time of year in Virginia waters when this is happening, I know there's tons of cobia around. And unfortunately, in Virginia, the regulators have not made strong enough decisions, in my opinion, to mitigate these net spills and the bycatch that's happening. Thankfully, in Louisiana, they just passed rules to set a distance buffer from shore because the same thing's happening there, whether it be a net spill or just dead red drum floating all over the place as they do that fishery. I mean, it's complete and utter waste of a resource. I think, I can't remember the exact numbers, but we're talking 30, 40, 50-pound redfish. They're a very long-lived species, just like striped bass. And so those big fish are 15 plus years old. And so again, I said it earlier, it takes that long to replace that animal.
Yeah.
Big redfish are not legally killed on the Atlantic coast anywhere. There might be a trophy tag in a few little places left in the Gulf, but we've made this decision. Let these breeders live. Let them derive what benefit we can through our catch and release fisheries for them. And this idea that this one company can go in and kill them, and frankly, really not be held accountable, in my opinion, because being held accountable means you're going to stop them from doing it again, not just present a fine or something like that. And that's the continued kind of challenge we have in trying to manage things in the Chesapeake.
Yeah, guys, it is such a Pandora's box that hopefully we can start getting into more. I would love to see you do a debate with all three heads in like a live C-SPAN thing. That would be fun to watch.
Let's do it.
Let's see. Old School Tackle TV. I think you know this guy. These seem like the same options that got us here in the first place. Good to see you smiling, angry Dave. Old School Tackle TV. Message me. You just want a gift card to Chick-fil-A.
So see how I'm not smiling right now? I look really angry. It's by accident. I'm usually not angry, and Brian likes to give me a hard time because he knows the joke. No, I'm serious at times, and that's what it takes. But for the most part, like as I've mentioned tonight, I try and get along with everybody. It is our resource, but I'm not afraid to get into a debate. So I'd love to see one of those. In fact, various partners of ours have floated that idea. So that we have a more transparent dialogue amongst folks that are in a position like I am, where I get to vote. Now, my vote's one of three, so it can be watered down and ignored in the state of Maryland. But the reality is, we have to be held accountable no matter who we are. And I am a big proponent of doing these things, talking to people, talking a lot at the board meetings. I definitely took up my share of the time last week. And you really don't hear from the state leaders nearly as much about their driving principles, their vision for these fisheries. If you go to our website, ccamd.org, and ccavirginia.org, because we're working together in the Chesapeake here. We have a gentleman named Chris Dollar, who's a conservation consultant. He lives in the northern neck of Virginia, is doing a lot of hard work in Virginia on our behalf. But also here in Maryland, we collectively put together something with boating and fishing partners that's called the Vision for the Future of Sport Fishing and Boating in the Chesapeake. It's a 16-page document, lots of pictures, but it talks about things like climate change, habitat, forage, managing for access, managing for abundance. And these are our guiding principles. We're not afraid to share them. You know what you're going to get when it comes to CCA, when it comes to me, because I'm out here talking about it and sharing it. And I think in this day and age, I think our state's leaders should be doing the same. They should be talking about why they're making those decisions and being held accountable by the public. Unfortunately, especially during the Hogan administration, things were happening behind closed doors. That's why some people have two fish and others have one. It makes no sense whatsoever to logical people and fair people. But in the closed door world of politics, it happened. So the reason we exist at CCA and the reason so many groups exist, whether you're a joiner or not, stand up, have your voice be heard, get involved in these committees we talked about earlier in Maryland. The Black Bass Committee, the Coldwater Fisheries Committee, the Tidal and Coastal Committee. These are built so your voice is heard. And, if there's folks that if you're interested in this stuff, reach out to me anytime. I will gladly draw you the roadmap for how you can get involved. And I don't care what the outcome is that you're trying to seek. I talk to commercial fishermen all the time and say, hey, I advise you to get involved and do these things too. Everybody should use that voice. We're extremely lucky in this country to have the privilege to harvest our resources, to maybe catch and release them, to derive income from them. And that means we have to be at the table. We have to be involved in the conversation, no matter how difficult it might seem or bleak it might seem, because I look at it a little bit differently. I remember catching my first striped bass after the first moratorium, and I've got a 5-year-old and a 9-month-old. And I start thinking about it as, if I do this hard work now, building reefs, educating people, trying to shape management, I hope that one day they're sitting here saying, okay, it worked. And now they're going to be the stewards of the resource. If that means it's a tarpon fishery and redfish and trout, then great. We still need the Chesapeake Bay to be healthy. and maybe we'll just have to drive up north to catch striper fish, to catch stripers in my lifetime. You never know. We don't know. I would encourage people, get to Jersey right now, by the way.
That is so interesting to me about when I was a kid, you had to go south to catch a tarpon or a speck trout like fishery or redfish. And people really didn't kayak. And now this place is starting to look more and more like what the Carolinas did. And I get like we're trying to do our best here, but to keep the striper around. But if this is the change, I mean, it's just an evolution that you see in nature. And the idea of having a striper or fishery here, I want that. The idea of having a tarpon fishery, that would be freaking cool as hell too. But you're right. We got to husband this the best of our ability for what we can control.
Yep. You can only control what we can. Fishing mortality, period.
Big Mike Fishing Chronicles. You just want a gift card to Chick-fil-A. Hello, I have a question. When I was younger, we used to go to the Haynes Point to fish for striped bass. Where do those striper come from? And where do they go when they leave Haynes Point area?
So in the Potomac, right? That's the Haynes Points area, like in DC.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening in the Potomac is similar to lots of the different tributaries in the Chesapeake, in that you get the migratory pulse of fish are going to start showing up in late January, February. Right now the bait's flushing out of the rivers. We have lots of resident fish. They're all going to concentrate. They're on the shallow water bars right now, just crushing it. You're going to see them all kind of, there's a nice fishery out of the Point Lookout, the Potomac. And that's going to be anything from, 12-inch long stripers are going to be somewhere, all the way up to, low 30s. You don't get a lot of male fish much bigger than that. So that's kind of like a fall into the winter. And then as you get into the winter and the winter moves on, January, February, March, you're going to start having fish from the north, fish from the ocean start to come in and stage in the Chesapeake. You're going to have a Virginia gillnet fishery that has no max size limit on the size they can kill. They can kill 985,000 pounds and change. The only regulation is the gillnet mesh size of 7.5 inches. And so those nets are going to be the first thing those fish are going to hit coming in from the ocean. There's also a wintertime gillnet fishery in Maryland. I don't know the Potomac seasons necessarily, but ultimately those fish are going to end up in the Potomac. The spawning reaches that I understand of the rockfish in the Potomac is going to be below DC, above 301, somewhere in that general area. I can't remember the exact spots, but ultimately, if you're catching big fish at Haynes Point, it's a seasonal thing where they're kind of hanging out. They might be chasing shad, river herring, other foods. They get all the way up to Chainbridge. I know guys catch them all the way up at Fletcher's, and so it's really the seasonality. If the Potomac population, like the fish born in the Potomac, are doing well, you're going to see a lot of small fish grow up through the fishery. Year 1, they're going to be 12. Year 2, they're going to be 17. Year 3, they're going to be 20 something. And it's just going to keep on going up. And so that's what I mentioned earlier, where in my experience, I used to see, looking at the data, being involved in fisheries management, I'd then go out fishing and I would see the different year classes kind of interacting and the different times of year that the fish are here. So very long answer. By now you realize I give very long answers. But it's important because this is a coast-wide scale. This is a Maryland-focused scale, a Virginia-focused scale. The data is what it is. Our fishing experience can vary day to day. It can vary from morning to evening based on tide, based on weather changes, based on all these types of things. And so your individual fishing experience is going to be different than the next and the next and the next person. So you might be fishing at Haynes Point, not catching any rockfish, but the guys that are there when you're not might be catching them. In theory, over time, if management is correct, you've seen that number go down because the population's gone down. And one last important point, actually pull up the young of year slide real quick. Should be up high.
What's that?
Number 1 or 2 series listening to.
Oh, way up there.
There you go. The purple one. There it is. Number 3. So if you zoom out just a touch, remember that the term catch at age, I showed it in those proportion charts before. We're catching 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old fish mostly in the Chesapeake. And depending on what time in regulation, they're mostly legal. So if a fish needs to be 3 before it's legal to be caught, well, we now have 5 years in a row of poor reproduction. And so then if you take it to the next level where it's got to be 8 before it's part of the spawning stock, the fish that were born in 2019 won't be part of the spawning stock until 26 or 27 because it's really 7 or 8 years old. And so it just keeps on compounding in time. It's going to take longer and longer and longer. The longer that this young of year situation exists, it's going to take longer and longer and longer before we really see a nice abundant year class up and down the coast. So the dark clouds are on the horizon. We're going to see it here in Maryland. It's going to be more difficult for a shore angler or a pier angler to catch fish in the near future. It's probably already gotten harder. And then it's going to continue to persist because the fish not born this year are going to be a gap for the next 6 years in the Chesapeake. It's not until 7 years from now that they're going to start showing up in the spawning stock biomass. 8 years that they're fully into the spawning stock biomass. So we've got quite a while before we really see it ever return to what we used to really enjoy. And that's what should be most concerning to people. That should be most concerning to the coastal fisheries as well, because while the Hudson does supply lots of big fish, and lots of fish, and there are a lot of big fish out there right now, I kind of said it a moment ago, get to Jersey, go fishing. I said it where my friend caught 30-some fish from 18 to 35 pounds on a 2-mile long school of bunker. There's lots of really big fish out there, but we purposely said you cannot kill them anymore. We know we need them. We need them to return to the Potomac, return to the Nanacoke, return to the Chop Tank, return to the Upper Bay, the James, you name it, and have a successful spawn. Because once we do, the clock starts ticking on when those fish are going to be catchable for us. And the only other way I like to describe this is as if you got laid off, money stopped coming into your checking account. You're going to have to stop spending because it's your money. And once it's gone, it's gone. Unfortunately, the state, the management system, et cetera, is kind of playing with the house money. They're managing the natural resource, which unfortunately is not here. Everybody's still getting paid to participate. The people that are going to get impacted first are the local tackle shops, the recreational fishing-based businesses, the charter boats, and the commercial fisheries, not the folks within the state. And so one important take-home message is to focus on the state. They have the authority, period, the end. You don't need to blame a commercial fisherman for the reason you're not catching fish, and vice versa. A charter captain should not be blaming somebody that catches and releases. A commercial fisherman should not be blaming somebody that takes home their one fish. We are the public, and we have to deal with what nature provides and people in our government choose to enact from a regulation perspective. So focus 100% of your comments on striped bass and to the management agency. The reason why you believe something shouldn't be because another stakeholder is at fault. It was the fault of Maryland DNR. It was the fault of VMRC to not reduce commercial harvest by 18%. It's not the fault of a waterman. Heck, if a waterman wasn't lobbying to keep more fish in their quota, they're crazy, right? When it comes down to it, if I had to lobby for one type of individual to have access to the fishery, it's going to be the public, and it's going to be through recreational fishing. That's just inevitable, which is exactly why CCA has been instrumental in banning gill nets in Florida, gill nets throughout the Gulf Coast, Texas, Louisiana, et cetera. Because when push comes to shove and management fails, the public should still have access. And if you can't manage a proper commercial fishery, close it. If you can't manage a proper recreational fishery, unfortunately, the answer is close it. The fish have to win.
Dave, I mean, thank you so much for coming on. I know you're insanely busy. We've been trying to do this for absolutely forever, but I promised everyone we'd keep this under 5 hours. Guys, link in the episode description to everything that we talk about. I'm going to make sure we have all of our links. And then, huge shout out to my audience. I know you guys generally like for these live streams, the old bait and tackle, and the fact that you stayed around for education, math, and statistics. I'm proud of you for that. I know this is going to do really well on the upload. And that's what's also so fascinating to me is all this stuff tracks so well And it really shows that there's a thirst for people to have the knowledge. I mean, I'm looking at Odenkirk right now. He already has like 600 downloads of people that are wanting to know what the hell he's doing. So there is a thirst in the public, like what happens behind the closed doors. And hopefully, with this platform, as we have been doing the last 2 years, it's to kind of like be the mediator of come and talk, because people want to hear what you have to say for the fisheries they live at.
Yep. And I wish I could condense this into like 1-minute reels or little stories, but
Yeah.
it's like coming to class. And I hope folks could sit through all this. If you're on a long drive listening at this point, not live right now, you're listening to this after the fact. I hope you took something away from it and you can pick it up and put it back down and listen. That's how I listen to a lot of long format stuff. And I listen to all the different podcasts, all the different advocates. I read all the different articles related to these topics, because in the end, we're all in this together and the fish belong to all of us.
Amen. So, again, guys, like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out in the algorithm as we keep pushing forward. A link in the episode description so you can be able to reach out to Dave, his organization, to comment on what's going on. We'll see you guys next time on Fishing the DMV. Bye. You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your host, Thomas Ahrens. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked up, I don't know what will.